All right, let's go ahead and get started. We're recording this because Neo's out, couldn't be here this week, so I'm doing a Zoom session over here, so that's what's going on with this if you're curious. It's being recorded, so just so you know what's going on, that's what that is. The other thing to remind you of is that, and I know this is a long way off, so you don't want to think about it, but it is worth reminding you we are in week 5. So the thematic papers are due on Wednesday, March 26th. Thematic papers are due for this class Wednesday, March 26th. By no later than 11:59 p.m. There's a D2L submission file folder for that. If you haven't started thinking about your paper for this class, that's a reminder to do so, right? To begin thinking about it at least. If you want to come talk to me, please do so. Feel free. You can write on whatever you want to, as long as it has to do something with the science of logic. If you want to build on your exegetical paper, that's completely legitimate to do. Lots of people do that. I certainly welcome those. If you want to do something different than that or work on something else, absolutely appropriate as well. So whatever you find most useful for you. And most people who come see me in my office start off with some big, huge, gargantuan idea, as we all do, and then we talk it through to where it actually becomes doable as a paper, because usually the gargantuan idea is not something that's doable, right, for a paper for this class, but worthy to do, but not for the class and for itself. All right, so that's that. The other thing is what you see behind me is a revised version of the table of syllogisms that I put up last week. I went through this week and, tried to pull out all of Hegel's examples of each one of the syllogistic forms, and some of them I modified a little bit. And, there's some in the encyclopedia logic, some in the larger logic, this logic. So I tried to draw on both of them. Like I said, I modified some of them, but they're all there. They're on D2L. I've uploaded it there if you want to take a look at there. So what I'm trying to do with that is give you examples of these forms in action, right? What do they actually look like? How they actually work? Some of them are, all of them are valid. Some of them are actually also sound, right? So you can, use them that way as well. But some of them are not. So take a look at that as you want. All right. I think that's that. Questions for me, issues, problems before we get going? All right. So I wanted to start off with a couple of things about what we're doing today. So the main task for the day is really twofold. And if we get both of them done, I'll be very happy. If we get one of them done, good. But if we get two of them done, very happy. The twofold thing to do today is, one, to see the transition, try to understand that transition from syllogisms to objectivity, from subjectivity to objectivity, right? So that last page or so really of the disjunctive syllogism account, where Hegel says the disjunctive syllogism is the completion of syllogistic form as such, and because of that, it's also objectivity, which is, I'm sorry, what's that mean? Part of that is, of course, what do we mean by objectivity? A question we've come up with several times. What do we mean by subjectivity? What do we mean by objectivity? We'll want to grapple with that question there. So we'll be doing that. The other thing I want to try to do is make some progress into the mechanism. I think we ought to be able to do mechanism, but into the chemism chapter. We won't do all the chemism chapter today. As you saw, the crazy end of the chemism account is crazy. He ends each one of those accounts with a syllogism, both the mechanism and the chemism account. But before we launch into the mechanism or chemism discussions, I want to just talk in general terms about what in the world is he doing in that chapter, right? What's going on? Why are we all of a sudden talk about mechanism? We were just talking about syllogisms, right? Those seem to be rules for, making judgments, putting judgments together into arguments. Why are we now talking about the world, right? And why are we talking about it in mechanistic terms, chemical terms, and ultimately teleological terms? And how do those terms match onto anything we recognize, right? Because the mechanism he's talking about doesn't look like our good old Newtonian mechanics, right? I mean, it maps onto it, but it doesn't map onto it. I mean, that's the problems with it. Chemism, what's that? I mean, that's not a thing we recognize typically. It doesn't have anything to do with chemistry, but then it does. I mean, it's weird. And then teleology is not, well, it is a form of teleology, but it's not the standard forms of teleology or the prominent forms of teleology we tend to think about. So we'll come back and talk about all that to try to make our way through the objectivity chapter. And to do so, I'll go back to a passage, we'll look at it fairly closely, to a passage in the overall plan for the division, right, of the whole subjective logic, the doctrine of the concept, and see what he says there, because I do think he gives us an outline, a kind of direction through. It's murky, it's hard to get, it's hard to make sense of, but it is a direction through the objectivity chapter. Will help make sense of what he takes himself to do, what he takes himself to be doing there. And crucial to that also is the distinction he draws between, this was happening, two different forms of objectivity, right? So two different kinds of objectivity. So we'll talk about that when we get there. All right. Before all that, I want to talk just a little bit, sort of step back for just a moment and talk about what's been going on in the subjectivity chapter for just a second. In the subjectivity chapter, we've talked about the relationship between universality, particularity, singularity. We've talked about how those get put together in judgment forms through the copula. We've talked about some predication. And we talked about that in how those judgment forms get put together through syllogisms in the syllogistic or inferential forms in the chapter we've been talking about. So I just wanted to think with you for just a moment about two pieces of that analysis. One piece of that analysis, just to remind ourselves, right? It's always useful to kind of keep this front of mind. When Hegel's talking there about concepts, predication, and inference, he well knows that he's talking about the rules by which we standardly think. So logic is for him the rules by which we think. He doesn't deny that. He thinks it's absolutely the case. It's absolutely wonderful. It's not really what his concern is in this book, so to speak. This isn't the rules of good thinking, but it is no doubt precisely that. Okay, yeah. So it is that. But he also thinks, as we know, that those rules for thinking aren't just rules for thinking, right? They're not just rules for the mind to use when it's constructing concepts, when it's constructing judgments, when it's constructing arguments. It is that, but it's something beyond that. So this is where he and Kant are quite close, right? When Kant goes back to these rules and says, we can use those as clues to how the mind operates, not just when it's making judgments, but how it operates when it's forming objects for itself. Right? Objects as they appear, representations, as he calls them, Kant. So there he calls that the leading clue, right, of the traditional logic. I think Hegel sees himself following in that lineage as well, right? I go there for that purpose. But where he diverges, is, as we've said before with him, where he diverges, importantly diverges from Kant, is he doesn't think you can just take him over wholesale. That you can just take over the table and sort of, start talking about the table of judgments, and here you got quality, quantity, relation, modality. So there you go. There's the categories of that govern the mind's synthetic activity, its combinatory activity in the construction of objects of representation. Hegel thinks you have to, he thinks that's dogmatic, right? He thinks it's just sweeping it over, taking it over. You haven't really vetted and you haven't really established the claim being made there, which is that these are not just rules for thinking, these are actually the rules for, in Kant's case, the rules for things, representations as they are given to us. But Hegel wants to say, I want to show two things. I want to show, one, that they are, in fact, a rational whole. That is to say, they aren't just a collection of rules that you put together. They actually entail one another. So that's this business that you see in Hegel that you don't see in Kant, about deriving, showing how judgment forms derive from concepts and how syllogistic forms derive from or are entailed by, better said, the judgment forms. So that whole discussion in the subjectivity chapter has got that as one of its missions. Let me show you why concepts entail judgments and judgments entail syllogisms. And as we've seen before, just rough and ready, quick overview of what that means, right, for Hegel, is this idea that, if you talk about conceptual determination, universality, particularity, and singularity, then singularity is both the loss and the return, right? This is this moment we've been to several times. Singularity is both the loss and the return of the concept, right? It's the loss and return of the moment of universality. And what happens there is, in the sense of return, it reaches its completion, right? The fruition, the culmination of this process of differentiation, this process of particularization, this totality that is a principled totality and not just a mere random assortment, but a principled totality, is precisely what this differentiation process is supposed to be about. And that's what singularity marks, as the completion of that. So every object is a moment in that completion of the process of the unfolding of the concept. You can say that. But it's also the loss of it. And the loss of it means that, precisely for the same reasons, not just because the understanding can do this, it does, but it does this because it does what its work is. The understanding always pulls things apart and holds them in rigid opposition to one another. He says the reason why the understanding can do that is because the loss of the concept is also contained in singularity. And the loss of the concept means that universality, particularity, singularity stand separable from one another. Stand separable, static, right, from one another. The fluidity of them, we've already seen. Universality just is particularity, particularizing of itself. There's nothing to universality except for that. And it comes to its fruition, its culmination in singularity. So you could just say they flow immediately into one another. There's really no distinctness between them. But in that moment of loss, the resolution of them, the coming to their completion, means they can be pulled out. They can be extracted because they're extractable then. So the understanding can do that. That's there to be done. It's not the ultimate truth of them, right? But it can be done with them because the movement of the concept permits its own formalization. It's a simple way of putting that. It permits its own formalization. That's not its truth, the loss, but it is nonetheless what it allows, what it permits, what it enables. But that moment of loss is also what moves us then to see, well, okay, if they're extractable, then how are they relatable? They're relatable through this, so the originary partition, the originary separation is that moment of extraction, the extractability of them, they're standing separable from one another. And then what does judgment do? It links them to one another. Now, here's the comparison I want to make, right? So I think this is really important. You can get lost, as we all know, in the judgment forms and in the syllogistic forms. And I appreciate that, there are particular questions about this judgment form and that that notion of syllogistic reflection or whatever. I get those, and I'll deal with those, and we can go along the way. But as we go along the way, but one of the main points I'd like to remind you of is just simply this: Hegel thinks that judgment forms are all about the copula. Judgment forms are all ultimately about the copula, about predication. And his claim about the judgment forms being about predication is that they only present a relationship between two concepts at a time. They relate one concept, singularity, to universality. They relate particularity to singularity. They relate, one concept to another concept at a time, the subject to the predicate. Now, this becomes more complex when you're looking at disjunctive judgments and looking at apodictic judgments. But for the moment, the main judgment forms are all about relating two concepts to one another. Now, is there a third concept always involved? Absolutely, for Hegel, right? That's what he's constantly saying, right? This subject is related to this other concept, but it's related through a third concept, right? So the mediational role, can say that, that's being played by the other concept, either universality, particularity, or singularity, is at work there, but it's not prominent because it's always being, let's call it this, buried in the copula, right? It's buried in the copula. So what the inferential forms tell us is those same three concepts are at work, right? Nothing really changes about that. But what the inferential, the syllogistic forms tell us is now that we see the three concepts, each posited, explicit on its own, and each one of them doing the work of mediation, because now the central role is played not by the copula of any of the premises. It's really played by the middle term, which mediates the role. This notion of mediation is going to come back today, so I just want to push it a little bit. It's mediating the role between the other two concepts. So if you take a look back on the screen, look at the table of judgments, you will notice that every single time we go through the syllogistic forms, you're going from SPU to PSU to SUP. Every single last one of them has that same structure, right? They're all involving all three concepts, of course, but they also go through where particularity is the middle term, singularity is the middle term, and then we finally end with universality as the middle term, every single time. But as I've said many, many times before, this is true in the judgment forms as well, that Hegel's message here is it matters what we mean by universality. That's what's different about the judgment forms from one another, is what we mean by universality there. And certainly it's what we mean, it's the difference between these forms, what we mean by universality there as well. So the claim is that the syllogisms of existence, of Dasein, are all about universality, but universality as a property that's born in or inheres within singularities. That's really what it is. It's a feature of them, a property that belongs to them in some way. So that's the nature of those kinds of judgments. That's what universality is ultimately in those examples, those inferential forms. In the syllogisms of reflection, he calls it, I should say the syllogisms of existence, he calls those the qualitative syllogisms. So he's clearly linking up, qualitative back to this notion of something exists, but also here something as a property. It inheres in things. Universality is not separable. It doesn't exist on its own. If there is something like red, to use the example that I'm using that Hegel uses, then it only is born in flowers, right, or other red objects. There is no redness into itself. But in the syllogisms of reflection, which are called quantitative syllogisms. Here now we've got a class concept of universality. It's entailed by the prior one, but it really is the flowing of this notion of universality into now not a property that inheres in things, but a class of which things are members. So again, we're going through the same three figures, so to speak. We're going from SPU to PSU to SUP. We're going through that again. We're going to have particularities in the middle term, singularities in the middle term, but ultimately universality is the middle term. Again, the same flow, the same entailment. But what happens with universality here is universality proves to be a collection, right? A collection of things that are instances, a class concept. So it's quantitative precisely in that sense. So we talk not about inherence, but about subsumption. Now I'm pushing this because, as you have seen now, crazily, Hegel's going to talk about those same syllogisms as though they were part of the world. A point we'll come back to. It's the other point I want to make, right? His claim is not just things are like syllogisms, but things are syllogisms. It's not an analogy claim, right? It's not a simile. It's not wonderful metaphorical stuff, but that's not what he's talking about. He's literally claiming that the world is composed it's composed of this process, and this process, movement of the concept, is nothing other than a syllogistically structured process. So I don't mean it's like a syllogism. I mean, it is a syllogism, right? That's his claim. We'll get there in just a second. So I'm pushing these because he's going to come back to them, right? Now, the last category of syllogisms that he has in the account here is the syllogisms of necessity. He calls this the relational syllogism or the modal syllogism. He has both terms for it. And here it's about determination is the term I've used for it. Here's where the universal is thought as a genus. And as we know, particularly in all three figures, I'll talk more about this in a little bit when I try to go through them. But this all leads up to the disjunctive syllogism that we ended with class last time. And this is where the notion, it's already there in the categorical, but it's also much more explicitly there in the hypothetical syllogism, that the universality specifies itself, right? It particularizes itself. And by virtue of that, because it's concrete and objective universality, not a property that inheres in other things, which Hegel will always call an abstract universe. Seems kind of counterintuitive, right? An abstract universal that inheres in things. I mean, that's not abstract. It's born within things itself. And yet Hegel says, yeah, but that's an abstract way of thinking of it. Why? Because it doesn't have any concreteness that it generates on its own. It's getting its concreteness by virtue of the fact that it belongs, inheres in something else. So the concreteness that it has is not its own generation. It's not its own doing, to put it in that way. He also thinks the class conception of universality is an abstract notion of universality because things are instantiations of it, but it seems to be broader than all those things. So they belong to it. So we've at least got that moment dealt with, but now it's belonging to it in the sense that it is instantiated in them, but it seems to be something over and above them, encompassing of them. Subsumption. So this last understanding of universality as genus is the genus that is not a covering concept. It's not the most vacuous, empty, being is the ultimate genus from Aristotle says this. It's not the most empty abstract category. It's in fact a category that determines its own specifications. So the genus is nothing other than its species. That line he used all the way back in the particularity discussion where he says, the genus is nothing over and above its species. The genus is nothing over and above its species. It just is its specification, its particularization. That's all it ever is. And that's what he thinks the categorical, the hypothetical, and ultimately the disjunctive syllogisms articulate better than any of the preceding syllogistic forms, and certainly the judgment forms themselves. So what the syllogistic forms do that the judgment forms don't do is they don't simply relate one concept to another. They show how all three concepts engender one another. They just show them distinctly, and then they show how they actually engender one another. And the key to that ultimately is universality understood as genus. That universality is, in the language of the disjunctive syllogism, universality is the middle term. Right? It proves to be the middle term that generates the major and the minor. It generates the other concepts, the other conceptual determinations of particularity and singularity. That's what's underlying all the other relations. That's what makes the syllogisms of reflection possible. It's what makes the syllogisms of existence possible. But it's what's entailed by all of them as well. All right, so that's a quick run through of a lot of material we've talked about, but I just wanted to keep that line of argument going there. Does that make roughly some general sense? I know all the particulars and the details may be blurry, but does that general claim make some sense? That's at least Hegel's analysis of it. Now, that other point, right, that these aren't just rules of thought. Hegel affirms they are rules of thought. So you can do your regular formal logic stuff here. You can talk about, these as rules of judgments and, the construction of concepts into judgments. So these are the categories of proper judgment making, and they're also the categories of proper argumentation. Here's the different kinds of arguments you can have, and here's how they would work under these different forms, right? So valid argumentation, yes. But Hegel's not examining these for the sake of valid argumentation. He's examining them because he thinks that, following out this notion, that what's going on in logic in formal logic is not just the rules of thinking, it's actually the nature of reality itself. And in particular, not just reality itself, it's the reality of, or the movement of, the concept. Now, we saw this already because actuality entails, right, the last moment of actuality entails universality particularizing itself in individuality. So we know that moment of, oh, here's the concept, and the concept has this, is the movement of freedom, right, because it determines itself. Is on view there, but his claim is that ultimately predication and inference are accounts of that same process and that same movement. And at the end of that account, which we come to in the disjunctive syllogism, this is a place we'll come back to in just a moment, it entails its own overcoming. Now, what's being overcome? What's being overcome is the subjective status of formal logic. So let's just parse that out again, because there's a couple of different ways, right, at least that we can understand that. And one of them is Hegel and the other is not, right? So to be clear about it. So let's deal with what he's not talking about. When he says that at the end of the subjective, at the end of the syllogistic account of the syllogisms, that we've now reached the conclusion, the climax, the culmination, and we overcome in this moment the subjective status of formal logic. He does not mean by that, oh, we get out of the head. We finally get out of the head because we've been in the head, right? And now we get out of someone's mind, because he hasn't been talking about someone's mind. What he has been talking about is the formal nature of these rules. They are to put it in slightly different terms, the structure of the process that is the concept, right? The structure of that process, the rational account, the logos, the logic of that structure, of that process that is that movement. But it's not the movement itself. It's the form of that movement, to use Aristotelian categories for this. It's the form of that movement, but it's not the matter of that movement. Be cautious with that, right? I think that makes Hegel's point correctly, but the form-matter distinction is never a happy set. It's an essential relation, remember, right? So always precariously we take that in to try to make some analysis, of whatever Hegel's doing. So we need to look at that question here. But here's what I think is going on, right, in that transition at the end, is he wants to claim that when you reach the culmination of syllogistic form, that this form-matter distinction collapses. That the syllogisms and the judgments and the conceptual determinations have all been forms of the process itself. They've been forms that try to capture and account for the process itself. When you unpack them and follow them through to their fruition, to their culmination, where they come to is something that overcomes that moment of being merely a form. Remember, Hegel uses the term subjective here, not to talk about us, human beings, agency, all that kind of stuff. He means subjective here to mean formal. So it's overcoming its formality, it's overcoming its formalism. And it entails its own content. Now, how does that work? These are the questions, right? But that's, at least as I see it, the claim on the table at that point. So if that makes a little bit of sense for the moment, we'll come back and unpack that, and I'll try to walk you through the murky waters of that transition. But if that makes some sense, then let's go back to the beginning of the chapter again and just remind ourselves of this claim, right? He says there that everything rational is a syllogism. This is on page 588, beginning sentence. it's the fourth sentence of the second paragraph. He says, therefore, it is not just that the syllogism is rational, a point that we all can concede to, right? That's law, metaphysical traditions, history. Let's think, if we're going to think, we need to think rationally. To think rationally ultimately means to think in syllogistic form, right? So inherited from Aristotle, but taken down through the medievals, Wolff says the same thing in Germany. I mean, this is standard of the day. That's not Hegel, right? That's not unique, I should say, to Hegel. He affirms it, but it's not unique. So he says, therefore, it is not just that the syllogism is rational, but that everything rational is a syllogism. So everything rational is a syllogism. You might think, well, he's restricting the claim there. He's saying, well, everything insofar as it's rational is a syllogism. And he's absolutely saying that. He's absolutely saying that. And you might think, oh, well, that leaves him some wiggle room, some outside room where you can say, well, everything that's rational is syllogistic, but hey, everything isn't rational, right? There is the irrational. He's talking about the necessary, so the contingent, right? So we can get out of these kind of huge claims that sounds like Hegel wants to make about everything that is rational and it's amenable to knowledge, right? To knowing. I don't think that's the case, right? When he says everything rational is a syllogism, he means everything insofar as it exists is rational. And is therefore, because of that, a syllogism ultimately. That's why this crazy objectivity chapter, when he's talking about clearly the world, right, in the broadest sense of the term, right, being, when he's talking about that, he's not saying you can think of it this way. The rational dimension of it is to be grasped this way. He literally means it and all of it, exhaustively, all that there is of it that exists is fully and completely accountable in terms of these syllogistic structures. So as frustrating as it is that he ends each of those discussions of mechanism, and even more so the discussion at the end of chemism, he ends them with syllogisms. That isn't just, hey, let me show you how logic can help you understand the material world. We didn't get any materiality, by the way, but looks like that. It's not what he's doing. He's literally saying mechanism is syllogistic at its core. It is a syllogism. Chemism is syllogism at its core. It's what it is. All right. Yeah. All that by way of some of that's review, some of that's trying to push us a little bit further. Does that make a little bit of sense? Questions? I mean, it's preposterous and nuts. I know that, but questions, issues, problems about any of that? I know that's incredibly difficult stuff, so I don't want to swipe it aside. So let's take a moment and look at the syllogism of necessity again, right? The syllogisms of necessity, these judgment forms. Sorry, these syllogistic forms. They unite the singular with the particular through a universal that is now a genus. That's really the definitive move here. So SUP is what you get to in every single last one of these syllogistic forms ultimately. It's the third figure in each one of the syllogistic forms. But here the universality mediates, right, between the subject and the predicate, the major and the minor terms, in terms of being a middle term that is a genus. And a genus specifies particularity and thereby specifies, engenders, creates singularity. So here the genus is what it is only in its exhaustive particularization. This is true of all the categorical, the hypothetical, and the disjunctive forms of the syllogism. And therefore it is really the thinking here of a principled totality, to go back to the discussion of particularity again. And thus the mediation of the singular with the universal. The universal is what it is only and through its disjunctivity, ultimately, its particularization. To be singular is thus now to be wholly and utterly a particularization necessarily posited, that is determined or specified by universality via its own, that is universality's own inherent negativity. So that's why he begins with the categorical syllogism. The categorical syllogism, in that inference form, the particular and the singular are both bound to the universal, the genus, by possessing a nature. They're both determinations of a species. That's why they could be categorical judgments and not just merely existence assertions. So he says there, but they do that in different ways. So just to use the example, particularity is joined with universality. So metals are elements. Particularity, metals are elements, universality. singularity to particularity. Gold is a metal, so it's one of those. So here what is he doing? He's saying these things are related through the middle term. What's the middle term? Metal, that's the universality. So how does this work? The connection of the singular to the universal is by means of particularity, but this particularity is now neither a shared property, it's not a shared property borne by singulars, nor a class of which singulars are members. Rather, the singular, here gold, is a definite type, a species, metal, of the universal determination, which is element. Consequently, here, the link between the three terms is asserted, contra the syllogism of existence, without condition. Right? So this isn't like it is this thing, right? We're asserting, but then we have to subsume it, or we have to show that it inheres. No, it's just being asserted as such. It's a categorical judgment. So the link, so it's without qualifications, without restriction. The bond between all three moments, three terms, we could say, is in a word categorical. So we have then gold is an element. It's a way of linking the two now together through a categorical assertion. Yet even in the categorical form, the bond between universality, particularity, and singularity remains extrinsic. It's asserted still, right? Even without these restrictions, even if they're there, we haven't demonstrated why they or how they belong to one another. So each moment must possess or share in the species, in the nature. That's how you get the link to work. So the categorical assertion does not account for the very necessity of specification. It doesn't account for how it's possible itself to make a categorical judgment. And that means it hasn't accounted yet for differentiation or particularization, but it assumes them, right? It's actually predicated upon them. It's built upon them. So accordingly, the second figure of the syllogism of necessity, the hypothetical syllogistic form, if A, then B, A, therefore B, right, articulates precisely this differentiating process. What the if A, then B turns out to be is if A, then B, then C, that's the differentiation. It articulates precisely this differentiating process as a process of particularization that is endemic to universality as a genus. So if anything is a metal, then it is an element. Gold is a metal. Right? So you can do those kinds of transitions now. The first premise lays out the causal production between universality, element, and its culmination in singularity, a metal. The second premise then asserts the bond between particularity, gold, and singularity, a metal. And the conclusion articulates the necessity of the intrinsic relationship between the three moments. Goal, particularity, is an element, universality. Now, what the disjunctive syllogism form does is to bring us back to that moment, right? So now we've added something notice this is really kind of crucial, that none of the other syllogistic forms have these logical operators. No if-thens, no either-ors. They were all just predications, now bound together through middle terms. But here we have operators brought into the actual judgments themselves. First, in the hypothetical if-then, which is what we would broadly call, Hegel wouldn't call it this, but we would broadly call a kind of causal operator, right? If you get this, then this is produced by it. We don't mean that mechanistically, right? We just mean it, here's this. If this is there, then that'll be there, right? That's the way that works. What the disjunctive syllogism form does is really nothing more than render explicit the self-differentiating nature of universality. This is its key move, right? That advances it beyond the hypothetical, the categorical, and the hypothetical. So the categorical really presupposes the hypothetical, and the hypothetical is really rendered explicit what's going on there, what makes it possible to say if this, then that, this, therefore that. What makes that possible is this differentiating nature of universality itself. So what the disjunctive syllogism form does is really nothing more than render explicit that self-differentiating nature of universality, and shows how the inferential logic operates wholly by virtue of this, what Hegel calls here objective or concrete universality. So objective or he uses those terms interchangeably, objective or concrete. So again, we still are operating with SUP, right? Singularity, universality, particularity. But here he says, this is on page 622, this is in the German 123 to 124, he says the middle term is the universality that is pregnant with form. Erfüllte, it's pregnant with, filled up with form. It has determined itself as totality, as developed objective universality. So uniquely, in the disjunctive syllogism, the work of mediation is accomplished through universality. That's what the third figure is telling you. Here, the SUP, the U isn't the same as it was before. It's not the same as it is in the syllogistic forms of reflection, nor that of existence. That is to say, the concepts of particularity and individuality or singularity are inferred, joined together. They mean the same thing, right? They're joined together, they're concluded, right? Schließen means to draw to conclusion, bring together. They're integrated, they're concluded with one another in and by way of universality. So universality is the mediator between singularity and particularity because it's also the engenderer, the creator, the producer of singularity and particularity. So they don't bear an extrinsic relationship that, in some sense, universality, connects. Right? The three are bound together. Well, the two are bound together, singularity and particularity, because universality brings them both about. It's what they are. Right? There is no singularity without particularization, and particularization just is what it is in its culmination in singularity. And that's all by virtue of universality being a genus that differentiates itself and is nothing over and above, right? So it's not a class. It differentiates itself, and that is all that it is. So objective universality is to be stood as contrasted then with, just to make this point again, I'm sorry to belabor it, but I do think it's important enough because we're going to come back to it massively in a different way in the objectivity discussion. Objective universality is to be understood as contrasted with what we could call qualitative universality. That's the property inherent universality, the shared universality, like redness is shared by many red objects, right? That's that form of universality, which we see operating in the syllogism of existence. But it's ultimately their downfall, right? Because the syllogisms of existence predicate all sorts of things and infer things from those predications, but ultimately they can't demonstrate anything with absolute certainty, right? They can't establish anything conclusively. That's why we have to go to the syllogisms of reflection. We've got to find some way of, taking all these individuals, these singulars, and showing how they're members of a general class. That's what's really going on here. So the universality can't remain simply at the level of qualitative sharedness. But then the objective universality is also different than the quantitative universality. This is the subsumptive universality of allness, to put it in those terms, which governs the syllogisms of reflection. They're all about how those singulars belong to this general membership class. But here's the conundrum you get to, right? Look at the last syllogistic form under the syllogism of reflection. The last syllogistic form there is analogy. One thing is like another. Because it's like another, if one shares the property, then the other shares the property, right? That's the basic argument being made there. So the example I give you is, and this is slightly modified version of what Hegel does, because he talks about these as, I think he calls them both earth, right? So it's confusing the way he does it. But here's the argument he gives you. The moon is a celestial body. Right? It's the third figure syllogism of analogy. The moon is a celestial body, so that's universality to singularity. The moon, celestial body. Celestial body is the universality, moon is the singular. The earth is a celestial body, so there's another one of the celestial bodies. So it's a particular now we're talking about, but it's also a universality, and it is inhabited, right? So the earth is inhabited. So what can we conclude? The moon, quasi celestial body, is inhabited. I said they were valid, not all sound, right? So there's one that's valid form, not sound. But the problem, of course, with it is, besides its soundness, just in its formal structure, its validity structure. The problem there already is, well, how did moon and earth get to be celestial bodies? I mean, it works because they're both members of the same class, and so you can infer one thing is true and as a member of the class is probably true of the other members of the class as well. So if one of them's inhabited, by analogy, others are inhabited. But that's all predicated on being able to say that they are both have some kind of necessary expression of the celestial body concept. And that's not been established here. All you've got is a class membership without any explanation, any account for how both those members of the class, purported members of the class, actually express the class in any kind of way. Well, of course, that's what the syllogism of necessity are all about, whether it be categorical, hypothetical, or disjunctive. They're trying to express precisely that point. So objective universality is saying it's not neither qualitative nor quantitative. It's got to be objective in precisely this sense. So it's not a particular universal. The objective universal is not a particular universal. It's not a singular universal. You can use those ways of thinking about it as well. A particular universal is a property or feature, characteristic shared by many objects, nor a singular universal. That's like a class, right? This universal or class that subsumes its various instances. Rather, objective universality is a totality that contains within itself at once both particularity and individuality, singularity. It's pregnant with form. That's what that term means for Hegel. It's pregnant. It bears within itself the generation of both of those other moments. So he writes this: as universality, it is first a substantial identity of the genus, Gattung, but secondly, it is such an identity that it embraces, aufgenommen, literally absorbs or receives within itself particularity, just is particularity itself. Can't think that aufgenommen as subsumptive, right? It's not a taking up in within itself, because then we fall back into the problems of membership, right? And fall back into the problem of quantitative way of thinking about universality. So the syllogism now works precisely because of this. So take a look at the examples. I try to give you different examples here this time for what Hegel gives you, right? The form of the syllogism is fairly straightforward. He gives two forms of disjunctive syllogisms, right? He says they work either way because it's really making the same point. So the first form is A is either B or C or D. Now notice A is the universality. It's either, here's its particularization, B or C or D, where B or C or D is exhaustive. Right? So we've talked about this problem before. It's totality, principle of totality. So that's what that first major premise is supposed to be. It's supposed to give you universality exhausted, right? Universality fully and completely particularized. Then and only then can you do the minor term. The minor premise. You can do, but A is B. You can say the universality is something. Then you can conclude, therefore, the universality is neither this nor this or this, or at least it's not being identified with those. The example I've given you now is triangles are either equilateral, scalene, or isosceles. Let's say those are exhaustive triangular forms. Then, but this triangle now is equilateral. Therefore, this triangle is neither scalene nor isosceles. That's what you can draw from that. Now, in one sense, yeah, right? As we talked about last week, mundanely, boringly true, right? Kind of non-informatively true. But Hegel's saying, right, that kind of simple inferential possibility is only there if universality is concrete, if it's objective and not qualitative. You can't do that with qualitative universality. You can't do that with quantitative universality. Why? Because particularity is not entailed by it. So that inferential chain that you can really do here, I've got this, so it can't be the other things. Or the flip side of that, now look at the other one, the major, A is either B or C or D. Again, that's exhaustive. But A is neither C nor D, therefore A is B. So triangles are either equilateral, scalar, or isosceles, but this triangle is neither scalene nor isosceles. What can we conclude? This triangle is equilateral. If those are exhaustive, you can do those kinds of things. They're boringly true, right? Manifestly true, manifestly, factually the case. But what he's saying is that that's all predicated on the concreteness of universality itself. So the major premise here is always the universal is the concrete principle totality of the particular species specification of itself. That's all it is. And then what you do in the minor to the conclusion in either one of the forms is work within that specification. Either deny the other ones or affirm the other ones, and you get to infer the other side because they're exhausted. So the inferential process both singularizes and particularizes. And the reason that it is able to do this is because the universality within which it moves, the mediating middle, that is the universality, is a genuinely concrete, comprehensive totality. That by way of review, but I want to go back through that because I thought that was worth thinking about again for just a moment. Questions about that? Yeah, please.
A little bit confused about the mediating middle and how these things here about it on us. I feel like it's
Okay.
the difference between participation,
Yeah.
relationality,
Yeah.
mediation, all of these different nuanced things that come to my mind when I think about the mediating the middle.
Yeah.
In reference to the objective logic.
Yeah.
And it seems like he's coming to a culmination.
Yep.
So what does mediating middle?
This is a fantastic question because everything he does after that moment where he's introduced and said, look, here's what disjunctive syllogism's forms are. He gives these two forms that we just walked through with this example. everything he wants to do after that is really all about, it turns around this notion of mediation, right? So it's well worth stopping for a moment and go, okay, what does Hegel mean actually at this point? What has he finally gotten to mean by mediation? So let's just back off for a moment from the text and say, well, look, if we're talking in the objective logic, we just stop with the objective logic, which is, enough on its own, let's acknowledge. But if we stop with the objective, if we stop with the last quarter and said, what does mediation mean? Well, it means you can't have one thing without the other. That's what mediation basically means, right? You can't have being without essence. That's a mediating relationship, right? So, and you can't have essence without being, right? So, but that's a relational way of thinking, and appropriately for the objective logic, it's a relational way of thinking about mediation. One thing is imminently necessary for the other thing to be. So one moment of a relata is absolutely essential for the other moment of the relation, right? One relata is necessary for the other relata. So far, so good, right? Now, another way of thinking about mediation is you don't have things directly. So we think about immediacy and mediation. So we think, oh, this is the way through, right? This mediates our relationship to something else, or one thing is mediated in its relationship to something else. Well, that's still true at the relational level. Notice, you don't have being directly. You don't have essence directly. You always have it in and with and through the other term, right? So being always has essence. You never get being as such, right? So this whole notion that you could just literally start and just be talking about being and never talking about anything else, he's showing you that's impossible, right? Being on its own necessarily entails essence. That's the big takeaway, right, from one of the many from the logic of being, is that the logic of being is not a logic that remains hermetically sealed into itself. It can't. Right? So qualitative determination, quantitative determination, measure, all that's real and out there in the world, absolutely that's true. But those relations ultimately entail something beyond themselves, namely essence. So the truth of being is essence. That establishes that mediating relation. Similarly, we know essence must appear. I'm staying with just the major sort of moments here. Essences must appear for reasons we've talked about. They're inherently self-contradictory. And what does that mean? Well, that means there's no essence without being. Right? Because to appear means they appear as what? The ground of existence. So we define now being as literally grounded existence. Well, what's its ground? Essence is its ground. So you don't get being itself and you don't get essence itself. You get one or the other through the other. All this is the way we would be talking about and be quite accurate and quite true to the notion of mediation if we said all this stuff in the objective logic. So you're not wrong to call those mediating relations. I think that's absolutely correct. But what Hegel's doing at this point is really following on from the movement from essential relations to absolute relations. We know absolute relations is about manifestation. It's the appearing that's appearing of itself, right? There's no ground on one side related to some existence that it's grounded on the other side. It is just this process that reveals nothing. It reveals only the process of revealing, right? What he wants to claim at that point is that, mediation is going to have to be rethought here. Mediation is not one thing is what you have to go through to get to the other thing. One thing being there that you have to go through to get to the other thing is what you're seeing in qualitative universality. Right? If you want to get universality, you're going to have to go find it in things. Not exactly what Hegel says, but that is the implication of what he's saying about the syllogisms of existence. They're all out there trying to make sense of the world, and the way you make sense of the world is to go find the properties that inhere in things, but those properties are really not abstractable from those things. So the only way you can get to them is to be mediated, right, through finding things that have those properties. Green, to stay with my examples over here. But then he's going to say, but the only way that makes any sense is if you can talk about a class called green, of which these are instances, and you can talk about other instances, like all the other books around here that have this color. So then you're talking about that is that through which, so there's the mediating relationship. But what he's ultimately arguing here, and pretty much uniquely here, is that you get to think about universality is not to think about it as one side of the relation that mediates the other side of the relation. That would be to fall prey still to a relational conception of mediation. A relational conception of mediation. One thing through the other. No being without essence, no essence without being. Now we could say no particularity without universality and no singularity without particularity. So they all mediate one another in that sense. They're all links to, to get to the other. But Hegel's claim is that mediation ultimately has to be understood in this processional way rather than this relational way. Sorry to go back to this, but I think it's what he's doing. So when he says mediation here, he's saying universality as a concrete universality. Engenders, that is, creates, produces the other moment. So it's not that through which you go to get to the others. It's literally what creates the others. So it's not they're mutually dependent on one another. That's fine language for essence of being and all the various categories that fall under essence of being, quality, quantity, measure, and so forth. But here, it's not that they, you can't have one without the other. It's that these things are all engendered by universality. So that's what he means by mediation here. It's not participation. It's not relational, right? All those are relational is ultimately my point back to you, is that mediation here is being shown to be ultimately a matter of generation rather than relationality. So when he calls universality the mediating middle, because it's concrete universality here in the syllogisms of necessity, when he calls it that, mediating universality, this is what he's saying. He's saying it's not that it stands in between two other things and you have to go through it to get to them, which is the relational way of thinking about mediation. He's saying, no, those other things are what they are because of it giving rise to them, it producing. So you don't go through it to get to the others. The others are there by virtue of it. So when he says that universality here is concrete universality is pregnant with form, let's go back to that line again. I'm pushing that because he comes back to it again, right? So this is a notion he'll go back to repeatedly about concrete universality, is it's full of form already. That is, it's engendering its own specification. That's all it is. And so it's only there that you have true mediation, not through something, but the creating of something. Does that help? Yeah. Push your point further because as we go along, because I think this notion of mediation, Hegel's not against you using mediation in the standard way in which we use it. He uses it that way all throughout the phenomenology, for example. He will constantly tell you there, you think something's immediate. It's not. You have to go through something else to get to it, right? This is sense certainty in a nutshell, right? You can't have the immediacy of the this because you're always having to go through here and now, which are time and space. And so you have to go through them. That's mediating your consciousness relationship to its object. So what you thought was an immediate relation is mediated in that sense. Hegel knows that sense of mediation, uses it all the time, quite happy to talk about it in those terms. But he's at this deeper level talking about how mediation is now not relational, but processional itself. Does that help a little bit with that, Amir? All right, so push it further as we go along. Come back to it as we go. Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, relatedly, this might be a bit of a trivial question, but
what question?
A
trivial question. Yeah, no.
But I'm just having a hard time conceptualizing, especially in the examples of disjunctive syllogism that we're working with, how universality is the middle term, because I feel like I'm kind of stuck in this logic, or at least it makes so much more sense to me to think of particularization as the mediation between universality and singularity. So could we maybe just go over that?
Sure. So when you reach the conclusion of the disjunctive syllogism, right? Let's take one of the examples. This triangle is equilateral. What are you saying there? You're saying in that sense, you're saying this singular is this particular. That's what you're saying, right? That's how that works. But the question is not, let's fixate on the judgment, right? Let's fixate on how the judgment came to be, right? Which is the flow of the inference itself, which is always Hegel's point. How did you get, what entitles that? What entitled you, that conclusion? What leads you to that conclusion? And the claim is the only way you can make that a triangle is this work is if you've got an exhaustive elaboration of what universality, triangularity in this case, could be. And if the other two are not what it is, then it's got to be this. If it's not if it is the other two, then it's not this, right? Or if it is one of the other three, then it's not the other two, right? So that's the way you can work that, is only because universality has concretized itself into these specifications, into these categories. Let me use broader terms than Hegel's using here. And it's only because of that that you can draw the inference from the minor premise to the conclusion, whatever the minor premise might be, whether it's affirming one of the species or it's denying the other two species, or whatever the species might be. Is that useful? Because I think that's incredibly important for where he's going to go with this. It goes to the very heart of what he wants to say. The only way in which that conclusion works, even though it doesn't have universality in it, right? I mean, that's the kind of interesting thing about it, because he's talking about this triangle, not just triangularity in general, right? And he's really drawing to the conclusion of SUP, so U is the middle term, but it doesn't appear. Where is it? Well, it's not buried in the copula here like it would have been in the judgment forms. Where is it at? It's actually doing, so it was buried in the apodictic form, it's buried in the disjunctive form back in the judgment forms. But here, you can see it clearly in the major premise. The major premise is the articulation of the concretion of universality itself, its particularization. Then everything else works predicated on that. Is that?
Yeah.
So it's as though, I don't mean to belabor your point, it's a wonderful point, but I just want to make this point because it's worth making, I think. It's as though that major premise, what it's doing is saying, here's the lay of things. This is an exhaustive principle totality. Now, within that principle totality, you can derive things from that. But only within that principle totality would you be able to derive these things from it, right? Notice, if that first premise was not exhaustive, if the major premise of a disjunctive syllogism wasn't exhaustive, then you couldn't derive anything from it. It'd be an invalid syllogism at that point. It'd be completely invalid. That's why the categorical and the hypothetical are important to come before this, right? They establish that we've reached unconditionality, that we've exhausted all particularization. So that's why I think that's crucial. And in a sense, then the inference from the minor to the conclusion is trivial, but trivial only in the sense that, the conceptual space has been so, the fabric of the conceptual space has been so elaborated that by virtue of that, you can then draw various things out of it, but you're drawing things out of it at that point, right? But they all presuppose, right? They're all built upon that first premise, the major premise. And that's universality particularizing itself. Thanks for that, Chris. It's good. All right, take a look with me now at 622 to 624. So we're going to work over some fairly difficult terrain, like the rest of it wasn't. And I'm looking particularly at 623, bottom of 623. Well, middle of 623, I should say. Because here's where he makes this stunning claim, right in the middle of 623. This is 124 in the German. So, the disjunctive syllogism, which is the culmination of all the syllogisms, right? He gives you maybe 2 paragraphs on it, 2 examples, not even examples, 2 formulas for the form of it, right? That's all he gives you. He doesn't give you the triangle example, right? That's taken out of a variety of other things, but it works to make his point. But then he says this, for second full paragraph down, 623 in the English, 124 in the German. Consequently, everybody see where I'm at? Consequently, what as such appears to be mediated, is the universality of A with the singularity. Like you had to go through it, right? But he says, the mediating means is this A, it's the universality, which is the universal sphere of its particularizations. Notice there is no universality unto itself. It's always its particularizations. And is determined as a singular. That's how this works, is because of that. Then he says, what is posited in the disjunctive syllogism is thus the truth of the hypothetical syllogism, the unity of the mediator and the mediated. So here's a line he's going to pick back up on in just a moment. This goes to the mediation question, right? It looks as though what you're talking about here is, I have to go through something to get to universality, in this case, singularity. But that's not what's going on here. Universality differentiates itself into singularity, and that's what we mean by mediation. So he says the unity of the mediator and the mediated. What's being mediated? Well, clearly the other 2 moments, right? So universality is mediating. It's the mediating. Is mediating what? It's mediating particularity and singularity. And for that reason, the disjunctive syllogism is equally, catch this, no longer a syllogism at all. He didn't say it's not a disjunctive syllogism, which he would have said if we're no longer talking about a categorical syllogism, we're no longer talking about a hypothetical syllogism. Like he said, we're no longer talking about an analogical or inductive or any other forms of syllogism. Here he's saying it's no longer a syllogism at all. Well, that's the signal, right? We actually have reached the culmination of what it is to elaborate syllogistic inferential forms as such. We also know that that's the marker for, we've now reached the exhaustion of all of the formal dimensions of what it is that we're articulating, which is its process that is a concept. He says, for the middle term, which is posited in it as the totality of the concept itself, that's universality. It's now the totality of the concept itself. It's universality particularizing itself into singularity. There, we've got that back. Well, didn't we already have that? Yes. Did we have it explicitly? No. Did we have it as it actually works? No. That's what the disjunctive syllogism ultimately gives you. That's what all the syllogisms give you, but it's certainly what the disjunctive syllogism gives you ultimately. He says, it's posited as the totality of the concept itself contains the two extremes in their complete determinateness. The extremes, as distinct from this middle term, are only a positiveness. Here, both of the senses, right? Positiveness means rendered explicit, right? They're made explicit, but they're also posited. They are caused, they're brought about. Are only a positive to which there no longer accrues any proper determinateness of its own. They can't stand on their own, right? There's what's been going on in every other one of the syllogisms. The singular could stand on its own, at least relatively speaking. The particular could stand on its own, at least relatively speaking. Universality could stand on its own, right? At least relatively speaking. The singular stood on its own, particularly in the syllogisms of existence. The particular stood on its own, particularly in the syllogism of reflection. And eventually, where do we get? We get to where the universality doesn't stand on its own either. It's got to be generating the other two of itself. He says, the extremes, as distinct from this middle term, are only a positive to which there no longer accrues any proper determinants of its own as against the middle term. The middle term now hasn't subsumed, right, the other two. That's not what that means. We know what subsumption means for Hegel. That's the syllogisms of reflection. So that's got to mean because it's created, it's produced the other two moments, which is the argument he's making. Now look at how he unpacks this, then we'll see where he goes, right? So the transition really begins in the last paragraph on 623, but bear with me and let's go through this next paragraph for just a moment. If we consider the matter with narrower reference to the hypothetical syllogism, so backing up one, going back to the hypothetical notice, he says, we find that there was in the latter, hypothetical syllogism, a substantial identity as the inner bond of necessity and a negative unity distinct from it. So universality was doing work there, but it wasn't rendered explicit in the work that it was doing. It had to be there, right? You couldn't get the if-then structure to work at all. The hypothetical structure wouldn't work in the major premise if you didn't already have universality particularizing itself. That's the only way the if-then works. Then you can assert something and then the consequent follows. The antecedent gives you the consequent. But he says, distinct from it, namely the activity or the form that translated one existence into the other. The disjunctive syllogism is in general the determination of universality. Its middle term is the A as genus and as perfectly determined, right? Fully and completely particularized. Also posited through this unity is the earlier inner content. So what was going on in the hypothetical syllogism is now rendered explicit. And conversely, the positedness or the form is not the external negative unity over against an indifferent existence, but is identical with that solid content. So here we have the moment of the form and the content in the syllogistic form being one and the same. Now he's about to play this out on a different level in just a second, but here he's just saying, look, now you don't have a form content problem in the syllogisms, right? The content was behind the form, hidden, buried in the form, presupposed by it, like you have in the hypothetical syllogism even. It's got a universality, it's a genus there, but it's not posited as such. Here we've got it posited as such. He says the whole full form determination of the concept is posited in its determinate difference in the disjunctive syllogism, and at the same time in the simple identity of the concept. So that's Hegel saying, now we've got the moments of the concept all laid out in their, explicitly laid out in their relationship, in their processional entailment from one to the next. This is how universality particularizes itself in singularity. So far, so good. So the disjunctive syllogism is different than all the other syllogisms because it renders explicit what had always been buried in all those other ones. That is, that you really need to have universality be concrete. He then says this. So here's the beginning of the transition into objectivity. In this way, so he's just said, look, the subjective dimension of the concept has been its formal, right? Its formal dimension. And he's just said disjunctive syllogisms don't have a form content problem. They're not formal. That's the claim he's just made. They're not reducible to their formality. They're not formalistic in that sense. In this way, the formalism of the syllogistic inference and consequently the subjectivity of the syllogism and of the concept in general. So now he's backed out, right? He's saying this isn't just true about syllogism, this is true about the concept as such. So here he's trying to talk about not just why I call this the syllogism chapter, but why I call this the subjectivity division. This formal or subjective factor consisted in that the middle mediating the extremes is the concept as an abstract determination, is therefore distinct from the terms whose unity it is. Now that's true, right? Universality stands distinct from, particularity stands distinct from, singularity stands distinct from. They're all distinguishable in all the other syllogistic forms still. But in this last form, the categorical and the hypothetical already, but certainly in the disjunctive, that's no longer the case. Then Hegel draws this conclusion from it. In the completion of the syllogism, which the disjunctive syllogism is the completion, where the objective universality is equally posited as the totality of the form determinations, it is everything that is there, right? It's that major premise that says, here's how everything is laid out. Now we can infer from that. He says, the distinction of mediating and mediated has, on the contrary, fallen away. Then he says, that which is mediated is itself an essential moment of what mediates it. That which is mediated is an essential moment of what mediates it. And each moment is the totality of what is mediated. Okay. So he's making a fairly straightforward point. I know it doesn't sound like it, but he's making a fairly straightforward point, but he's also drawing from that a much more profound point. So let's talk about both of them. In one sense, he's saying, look, the problem that's been endemic with all syllogisms is not endemic in the disjunctive syllogistic. What's that problem? That which is doing the mediating is always separate from what it mediates. That the universality as concrete universality, as genus, has already, you can't do syllogisms of existence, you can't do syllogisms of reflection, frankly, without the genus concept. You really can't. That's his point, right? So you can think all you want to about, qualitative property inherent universality. You can think about quantitative class membership universe. You can do all that stuff, but the only way any of that stuff actually has those connections is if their connections, their linkages with one another are formed by virtue of the genus concept underlying the genus particularizing itself. So always the mediating concept has been separate from that which it mediated, all these forms. So in one sense, he's saying exactly that. Now, finally, the mediating term, universality, concrete universality, the genus, has been made explicit. So the mediating, mediator, mediated distinction collapses. We good? That's the fairly straightforward point he's making. So we've exhausted now the syllogistic forms. Doesn't mean you can't do syllogisms anymore. Just means the forms have been exhausted in their entailments. There's nothing more to be entailed by it. That's the fairly straightforward point. Straightforward for Hegel. It's not straightforward in any sense. Nobody else is in formal logic class going, now we've reached the exhaustion of all, that's not formal logic talk, right? We don't worry about this stuff. But when you're trying to show the entailment structure and prove the completion of all of the judgment forms or all the syllogistic forms, this is what you're worried about. When have we reached the culmination of all forms? But he's also saying, as he's about to unpack, that because the mediated relationship has collapsed, that we're no longer talking about something that's merely subjective. That is to say, we're not talking about something that's merely formal anymore. Oh, wait a minute. So what you mean by that is the form content has collapsed. All these other syllogistic forms have presupposed a content, right? They're mediating, and they're all mediated. That's what's really going on here. That's what you're talking about. Universality lurks behind, right, all the other syllogistic forms, and now it's been rendered explicit. So now we don't have a mediator relationship anymore. That's collapsed. It's fallen away. So that's what you're talking about. And Hegel says, I do mean that, but that also means something more than just that. It means that these can't be merely formal anymore. They have to be objective. Okay. That's a lot to swallow, right? Because the claim is a judgment form, a syllogistic form, an inference form, has been shown to reach such a state of explicitness that now that judgment form no longer suffers from a form content problem within it. The form content, the mediated, is collapsed. And that doesn't just mean we're finished with all the syllogistic forms. We're kind of done. We can stop now. It actually entails the next move, which is to say, and that means that is objectivity. Now, a lot hinges on, of course, what we mean by objectivity. More work to be done there. We'll do it in just a second. But notice what that claim is. That claim is saying we're no longer in a moment where we're saying, look, concept, judgment, and syllogism are just the forms of this process we call the movement of the concept. They are that, but they're not just that. And how do we know that? Because they themselves don't have to go out and be applied to some content that's coming in outside of them. This is the Kantian problematic, right? How do we get the forms to, we have to wait for the matter of sensible intuition to come in. Then the categories, that's a horrible account of Kant. Let me, preface that by saying that, but it does seem to be the case that, you've got to have intuitions. If you don't have sensible intuition, then the categories are worthless. But once you've got sensible intuitions, we got stuff to work on now, right? The sensible manifold, as Kant likes to call it, is something to be organized. The blooming, buzzy confusion of the sensible manifold can be organized in accordance with quality, quantity, relation, modality. We got it, we'll go to work. So the synthetic combinatory activity of the mind, right, cognition, can go to work on that and render representations, objects of experience. But Hegel's saying, no, the content doesn't come from without. The content doesn't come extraneously. It doesn't come extraneously. It doesn't come from without. It comes from concrete universality generating itself. Concrete universality particularizing itself. Oh my God, come on, that can't be right. But that's exactly what he's claiming. Look in the next paragraph. He just, true to Hegel, right? He's going to take this last paragraph and go, let's see what we've shown, right? And this is a review, but it's a review that's also a transition. So look at how he does this. Last two paragraphs here, I'm sorry. 624. The figures of the syllogism exhibit each determinateness of the concept singly. Right? So he just reviews. I've shown you this, right? This is what this is all about. As the middle term, a middle term which is at the same time the concept as an ought, right? It ought to be this, right? So singularity can be this. That's, we see the singular as being the middle term in the the syllogisms of existence. Particularity is the middle term, right? And the syllogism of reflection. He says the requirement that the mediating factor be the concept's totality. It ought to be that, but it's always relational. It's always joining them together. So that which is being mediated stands outside that which is doing the mediating. The different genera of the syllogism exhibit instead the stages in the repletion or concretion of the middle term. In the form of syllogism, the middle is posited as totality only through all the determinacies, but each singly discharging the function of mediation. So where do you get universality? You get it only as it belongs to singulars. That's where its concretion comes. In the syllogism of reflection, the middle term is the unity gathering together externally the determinations of the extremes, subsuming them under itself as class concept. So here he's just giving you, here's what universality as qualitative universality, as property inherent universality. Here's what universality is as class concept. Then he says, in the syllogism of necessity, the middle has determined itself as a unity that is just as developed and total as it is simple. And the form of the syllogism, which consisted in the difference of the middle term over against its extremes, has thereby sublated itself. Okay, so that's Hegel just restating what we've already seen before, right? This final form of syllogism, the syllogism of necessity, in particular the disjunctive syllogism, but it's true for all three, categorical, hypothetical, and disjunctive, is overcoming precisely this distinction. There's not a concept, there's not a universality that stands over and above. It just is this work that we see it doing. So it's not a middle term over against its extremes. It gives rise to those extremes. It engenders or produces those extremes. Then he says this. With this, the concept in general has been realized. What do you mean by that? That sounds sneaky. Been realized. Well, in one sense, it clearly means it's been brought to, now we've got the concept fully on view, right? You want to know what the structure of the process that is the concept is? Disjunctive syllogism. That's what it is, ultimately, right? That's the process, not just by which you can argue validly and well, and maybe stupidly, right? But it is the very nature of the process itself. It's what that process is. It's what determinate negation looks like. It's the rule that it follows as it elaborates itself, as it generates everything. So it means that, but it also means something more. Look at what he says. More precisely, it has gained the kind of reality which is objectivity. So it's been realized means it reaches culmination, right? Yes. There are no more syllogisms, there are no more forms to go through. We've exhausted them. It's realized itself completely. But that also means, he says, that it's reached reality, it's reached objectivity. And that's the one you want to buckle at, right? If you accept the first one, you might go, okay, Hegel, you got me. There's no more syllogistic forms. That's an exhaustive table. I'll give you that. But now you want to tell me that that last syllogistic form actually is objectivity itself? Not that it's waiting for objectivity or some materiality to apply itself to? No. Why? Because the mediator relationship has fallen away. Look at what he does. It has gained the kind of reality which is objectivity. So now he gives you a brief rehearsal over the preceding 600 pages of what he's meant by reality throughout the book. So he says this. The first reality was that the concept in itself, negative unity, partitions itself and as judgment posits its determinations in determinate, indifferent, and difference. So there's the judgment way in which we talked about reality, right? That distinction. And as judgment posits its determination, determinate, indifferent, difference. And in the syllogism, it then sets itself over against them. Since it is still in this way the inwardness of this now acquired externality, in the course of the syllogism, this externality is equated with the inner unity. The different determinations return into the latter through, that is, into the inner unity, through the mediation that unites them at first in a third term. So there's that moment of relationality, right? They all return because they all brought back to universality, but it's really thought there. Universality is thought subsumptively. And as a result, the externality exhibits in itself the concept which, for its part, is no longer distinct from it as inner unity. That's collapsed. So now the form-matter distinction, let me use terms that Hegel's not using here, but the mediator relationship, form-matter distinction, has fallen away. We're not talking about the form of the process that is the concept. We're talking about the concept as it actually is, as it exists, not its form, its subjectivity, but its objectivity, as it is, in being. He says, conversely, however, that determinateness of the concept which was considered as reality is equally a positedness. That reality is something that we produced through what? The concept produces it. That's been the message of the book thus far, right? To be is to be essence, to be essence is to be concept, and the concept then produces essence and being. For the identity of the concept's inwardness and its externality have been exhibited as the truth of the concept, not only in this result, but on the contrary, already in the judgment, the moments of the concept remain, even in their reciprocal indifference, determinations that have significance only in their connection. So they can't be separated from one another. They're relationally implicative of one another. But then he says, its movement is the sublation, so the movement of the analysis, is the sublation of this mediation in which nothing is in and for itself, but each thing is only through the mediation of another. Here's this notion of one thing you have through the other. But then he says, the result is therefore an immediacy that has emerged through the sublation of the mediation. What did that? Concrete universality. It doesn't mediate by going through something else. It mediates by being the constitutive origin of those other things. A being which is equally identical with mediation and is the concept that has restored itself out of itself. He's going all the way back and saying, now we can talk about being again. Right? Now we can talk about being again, because being is engendered, being is produced by the process we've been elaborating under these concept determinations, these judgment forms, these syllogistic forms. But now we can see how being itself is engendered by those that very process, because now the judgment and syllogistic forms are part and parcel of the world. That's what they've shown themselves to be. So we don't have to wait, right, for the sensible manifold to show up to apply the rules of judgments or the rules of syllogisms. They entail objectivity of themselves. Kant, you're wrong. It's a simple message he's putting forth at that point. You're wrong. The concepts, the subjective determinations of the concept entail their own content. This in a nutshell is, form engendering its own content. That's what makes Hegel Hegel. If you ask me, when you push me about what's Hegel's real insight when he's talking about form matter, he doesn't think you have to wait for matter to be informed. He doesn't think that matter is something extraneous to form, that it's not something that's, form is embedded in matter and it has to be shaped and molded, and none of that. Right? Because all of that says that form and matter are distinct from one another in various different ways. He thinks that form entails its own materiality. Now, what he means by matter here is something very abstract, of course, right? He doesn't yet mean nature. He doesn't yet mean spirit. None of that's here. There's no space-time. We don't all of a sudden get the world, but we do get the fundamental layer of the world, being itself. That's what he's just asserted. So as he says, a being which is equally identical with mediation is the concept that has restored itself out of and in its otherness. This being is therefore a fact, Sache, which is in and for itself, objectivity. So Hegel's claim is that the falling away of the distinction between, let me use slightly different language, the form and the content, right? The subjective and the content of that subjective, that is to say, the structure of the movement of the process of the concept and the concept itself. That in the final moment, right, what we've seen in the disjunctive syllogism is that distinction of the mediating and the mediated, fall away, doesn't just mean that we're done with the syllogistic forms and done with the logical forms. We are. But it also means that we're done with subjectivity, because subjectivity necessarily entails objectivity of itself. Not Hegel came along and said, now we got to find some place to, apply this damn stuff, right? What does it apply itself to? How does it, how does form make of matter something? He's saying form engenders matter. Form engenders its own content. Objectivity, that which is in and for itself, which is the first, he's going to give us two senses of objectivity here, but this is the first sense. And it's important that you get these two senses. We'll talk about them in just a moment. But the one he starts with may be kind of surprising, because we would think he would start with the other one. The other one he's going to talk about is that objectivity is that which is distinct from the form. And you think, oh, wait a minute. We'll start with that, and then we'll get to the in and for itself, right? That's the way we'll go. It's actually the reverse. Mechanism and chemism are discussions of objectivity in the sense of what is in and for itself. It's what he called, all the way back in the plan he was laying out for this division, it's where the concept is fully and completely submerged in objectivity. That's where we are. When subjectivity entails objectivity, the concept is fully and completely submerged in it, then it's indistinguishable from it. It's at work in it, but it hasn't yet distinguished itself from objectivity itself. It will. That's what, believe me or not, that's what's going on at the end of the chemism discussion. Right? That whole crazy thing about the catalyst and the activating principle and all that, that's what that is. That's an account of how the concept is in objectivity, but not reducible wholly to objectivity. And that's why the discussion of teleology will be a discussion of instrumentality. How can objectivity be at the behest, at the use of the concept? How is it available to? How is it can be this for the sake of the concept? It's all about external, extrinsic teleology. It's about what in another set of terms we could call instrumentality. So the conception of teleology there means simply that everything that exists for the sake of something else, for the sake of the concept. Why? Because the concept came and subdued it and dominated it and took it over? No, because the concept engendered it, brought it about, constituted it, produced it, and is not reducible to it. If it were reducible to it, if the concept was just mechanism and chemism, then we would have an account of objectivity that has within it the concept at work, but not yet the concept free. It wouldn't be self-determining. It wouldn't be self-causing. That's the claim. All right. Just a second. So yeah, let me take a question, then we'll take a break. Yeah, please.
Mediating relation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking at if you look at the plan of the book.
Yep.
In general.
Yep.
He started with being as such.
Yep. Yeah.
Then essence.
Yep.
And essence must appear.
Yep. I wouldn't call it phenomenology. Phenomenology implies that there's a consciousness perceiving it for Hegel. That's not what's going on there. There's no conscious subject in this book, right? There is no phenomenology in this book. He knows what a phenomenology is. He wrote one, right? So, I mean, I'm just being stickler for that term, but go ahead.
Why not? Why not?
Why not?
Point of view is not explored here.
He thinks that this account is all about conceptual determinations that are not predicated on consciousness. So there is no, well, this is the, I mean, let me state it. This is a good question. I'm just trying to be careful about the answer. So he does not think that to show how these entailments work, that a reference to consciousness is required. Kant always said, if you want to understand this is how this is like this, remember it's all in relation to us, right? It's for us. Basic message of Kant, right? On all three critiques, this is the way, I don't know how things work in themselves, right? I'm an agnostic about the noumenal. I can think about it, but I can't know it. What I can know about is things as they are for us. I can know that a posteriori, that's empirical knowledge, but I can also have a priori knowledge, but only insofar as it's an object for us. Yep. I can save metaphysics, right? That's why he wrote a Metaphysics of Morals. He wrote a Metaphysics of Natural Science, because he thought you could redo metaphysics in terms of Kant, because you could redo metaphysics in terms of the synthetic a priori knowledge you could have of how things can be for us. So it's always about for us. And Hegel is saying you can have synthetic a priori knowledge of the noumenal. Knowledge, right? Erkenntnis, full, complete knowledge of the noumenal. Why? Because conceptual determinations, both for thinking and for thought and for being, are entailed by their own structure. These conceptual determinations follow themselves. So when we say the concept, or sorry, that essence must appear, we don't mean appear to a subject. That is true too, right? So we can now say, well, that's how you can do a phenomenology. But we're not doing a phenomenology in that regard. We're saying that essences must appear just as means they must ground existence for them to be what they are. They must other themselves, and that's what it means for them to other themselves. That's an ontological claim for him. Right? It's not a phenomenological. It doesn't have anything to do that essences for us must appear. Right? He's saying essences in themselves to be essences must appear. Notice. So I interrupted that. So go ahead.
Second question related. So can we treat the three sections of the subjective logic? Yeah. With regard to the analysis of mediating middle. So the mediating middle of the subjective logic part is objectivity.
You mean in the layout of that chapter, of that part? Yeah, yeah.
Like in the macro sense of the book.
Yeah.
Is the mediating middle of the whole logic essence?
I mean, I think those things are true, but I don't think mediation means the same thing in both those cases, right? So essence, as we talked about earlier, essence being the mediating middle of the book is different than saying that it's one side of the relata through which you have to go to get to being and being to get to essence, right? That's a different claim than that. So one means that there's a mediating middle of the book, means essence is what you have to go through to get to concept. But Hegel's ultimate claim is that the concept is the middle, even of the book, where, You'd be hard pressed to go into the logic of essence and go, here's the concept. It doesn't appear until literally the last page. But then, of course, let's be clear, you can reread the book and say it was on every freaking page. You just didn't call it the concept then. Anytime we talked about a process that brought about the becoming, reflection, transition of one thing into another, infinitizing, we've been here, kind of 1,000 times as we've talked about before, right? There's all these moments where bursting out from underneath the relational analysis are these processional moments, and then they recede back because the only way we can understand them at that moment, at that time, at that stage of the analysis is relationally. We don't yet have a processional logic unto itself. So it's been there all along, but Hegel's going to claim that it's ultimately the concept is the mediating middle, even though it comes last, right? It's the retrogressive ground of the whole book. Does that help at all?
Yes.
So this thing about objectivity is important, right? Because of the role it plays. And I want to come back and talk about that in just a moment, because I want to go back to the plan. So we're going to go back to this thing he does all the way back on let me find it again, sorry. I thought I had it hammered up. Oh yeah, pages 526 and 527. So 100 pages back, right? It's a lot to think, oh, you remember that, right? No. But he does say this. Take a look at what he says. Yeah, 527 is really where I'm going to be working from, but this is page 30 in the German. Look at his summary now. I always think that the first time through these, overviews, you think, I don't know what that means, right? And I'm not claiming the second or third time through it all is crystal clear. I'm not about to say that, but it does make some more sense of what he did, what you've now seen him do, and now how you can read the rest of what he's doing. So look at what he says here. Yeah. He says, I'm trying to pick a good place to begin. Yeah, start back on the bottom. I'm sorry to do this, but 526, the last paragraph. At first, therefore, the concept is only implicitly the truth, because there's only something inner. It is equally only something outer. It is only at first simply an immediate, and in the shape, its moments have the form of immediate fixed determination. So this is just quick and down and dirty way of saying, here's what the subjectivity chapter is about, right? It's about these three moments, universality, particularity, singularity, and they kind of got a fixity about them. Now, the whole point of that chapter has been they don't stay fixed. In fact, they entail one. They fluidly flow. That's what they are, into one another. So he says now, he calls this subjectivity, this stage, this is the fourth line down on page 527. This stage constitutes, therefore, subjectivity. You say, oh, so now we're talking about the human mind. We've been here before, but he says, or the formal concept. So there's the equation between subjectivity and formalism. We've just undone formalism. That's what happened at the disjunctive syllogism. But look at what he does in this recounting of it. Its externality is manifested in the fixed being of its determinations. You get universality related to particularity related to singularity. That's really about the judgments, right? That's what judgment is doing, is relating those fixedly, rigidly to one another. He says, of its determinations that makes them come up each by itself, isolated and qualitative, and each only externally refer to the other. So that's really what judgment is. That's what predication is about, right? Is saying, this universality is this particularity. This singularity is this particularity. It's asserting those as distinct from one another. Then he says, but the identity of the concept, which is precisely their inner or subjective essence, sets them in dialectical movement. It's one of the few times where Hegel talks about a dialectical movement, right? I mean, we talk about dialectics all the time with Hegel. This is one of the few times that Hegel actually talks about it himself. And he's saying this process that we're seeing, that we've been witnessing and tracking through concept to judgment to syllogism, is the setting in motion of these determinations, universality, particularity, singularity, into a kind of dialectical movement. So what is a dialectical movement? It's universality particularizing itself into the singularity. He says, then, and through this movement, their singleness, their isolatableness, their extractableness, their standing on their own, is sublated, taken up, canceled, preserved. And with it also, here comes the kicker where we're at, and with it also the separation of the concept from the subject matter. So there's the concept in its formal sense, subjective sense, from the subject matter. That is the process itself, the ontological process, generative process itself. And what emerges as their truth is the totality that is the objective concept. So once you can show that these rigid determinations, which are separable from one another, like in judgment, can't remain separable from one another, they actually entail one another, and they do so because universality necessarily particularizes itself into individuality, singularity, then the syllogistic form can't be separable, right, from the subject matter itself, from the process itself. And that means it's got to be actual, real, the world, being, objectivity. Then he says this. We'll come back and ponder about this middle paragraph. So we just moved from the formal concept, which is subjectivity, into the objective concept, which he also calls the real concept. Look what he says here. Second, in its objectivity, the concept is the fact itself. Notice back over here on page 624, he just called it the fact, right? The Zaka. So that's the linkage. He's clearly 100 page. He's referring to 100 pages before and saying, now we're where I was talking about, but only now. It's not just a subjective formal structure. It's actually manifestation itself. It's actuality itself. So the concept is the fact itself as it exists in and for itself. So there's that language again too of now it's not just subjective, it's not just formal, it's actually out there in the world, to use a kind of rough way of talking about this. The formal concept makes itself into the fact. So the subjective concept, right? The syllogism, the concept judgment syllogism makes itself, we don't do this, into the fact, to objectivity, by virtue of the necessary determination of its form, not because it applies to something, but because the form engenders the content itself. And it thereby sheds the relation of subjectivity and externality that it had to that matter. It engenders it of itself. Or conversely, so here's another, if you don't like that way of saying it, here's another way of saying the same damn thing. Objectivity is the real concept. It's the concept that generates its own content out of itself. It's the form that generates its own content. That has emerged from its inwardness and has passed over into existence. Okay. What does that look like? We'll talk more about that now, going back to the actual discussion. But then he says, in this identity with the fact, the concept thus has an existence which is his own and free. So the fundamental problem in objectivity is going to turn out to be, how is the concept free in, through, and by virtue of objectivity? In, through, and by virtue of the fact, in, through, and by virtue of the subject matter, in, through, by virtue of being. But this existence is still a freedom which is immediate, not yet negative. It hasn't reached up to that stage when you first have it. Being at one with the subject matter, the concept is submerged in it, not yet free, submerged in it. So when you start talking about mechanism, you're going to look at the concept now submerged in objectivity, which means roughly it's not free yet. It's not self-engendering. Its differences are objective determinations of existence in which it is itself, again, the inner, as the soul of objective existence. The concept, as the soul of objective existence, the concept must give itself the form of subjectivity that it immediately had as a formal concept. So it must prove itself to be actually this syllogistic process. So it's going to submerge itself into objectivity, and then by virtue of our analysis of objectivity, it's going to bear out that it is actually this process within objectivity itself. And so in the form of the free concept, which in objectivity, it still lacked. So, the simplistic thing to say about the objectivity chapter is it's about the concept submerged initially in objectivity, and then eventually showing itself to be free in and by and through that objectivity. That's what, roughly speaking, the mechanism to chemism to teleology, the end of chemism into teleology, is about precisely the concept not being reducible to, not being submerged in objectivity and being, but actually being that which generates that, so that then objectivity becomes for the sake of it. It's distinct from it, so we can now talk about it as distinct from it too. It has then a relation of extrinsic teleology with it, objectivity. All right, more about that as we look forward. Let's take a break. 4:40, come back at 4:50, and yeah, I'll see you then. We'll do this. Okay, thanks.